multilateral international development, multilateral institutions, and international economic, energy, and environmental policy will come to order. I want to thank the ranking member, Senator Merkley. I'm grateful once again for our continued bipartisanship on a range of issues. The title for today's hearing is A Multilateral and Strategic Response to International Predatory Economic Practices. Now, this hearing falls squarely within this subcommittee's jurisdiction, which includes multilateral institutions and international economic policy. Today, we have an impressive group of experts joining us to discuss this important issue. Our witnesses today include Mr. Matthew Goodman, the Simon Chair in Political Economy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Mr. Michael Wessel, a commissioner with the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission, Mr. Kimberly Glass, Executive Director of the Blue-Green Alliance, and Dr. Robert Atkinson, President of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. Welcome all. Given the excellent group of experts, I'm eager to hear from each of you. Before we do so, however, allow me to make a few comments to frame and catalyze our discussion this afternoon. Let me state up front my premise for this hearing. I believe America's national security rests largely on an economic foundation, and that predatory economic practices by China and others have undermined that foundation for years. If left unaddressed, these predatory practices will further endanger not only the prosperity of Americans, but also our security. That's why I believe we need to respond in a smart, multilateral, and strategic manner. That requires us, as you write in your prepared statement, Mr. Goodman, to start with cool-headed analysis of the challenges and opportunities that face the United States. It's clear that China is not the only country engaged in predatory economic practices. However, China's predatory economic practices are unique in their scope, their nature, severity, and consequences. As you wrote in your prepared statement, Dr. Atkinson, China is in its own league when it comes to fielding predatory economic and trade policies and practices. Dr. Atkinson, you summarize quite nicely the challenges that many Hoosiers and Hoosier companies have confronted in dealing with China. I've seen it firsthand. You write, quote, China has deployed a vast panoply of innovation mercantilist practices that seek to unfairly advantage Chinese advanced industry producers. These practices have included forced technology transfer and forced local production as a condition of market access, theft of intellectual property, curtailment of even outright denial of access to Chinese markets in certain sectors, manipulation of technology standards, special benefits for state-owned enterprises, capricious cases to force foreign companies to license technology at a discount, massive subsidies, and government-subsidized acquisitions of or investments in foreign enterprises. And that's not a comprehensive list. These deliberate and systematic practices by Beijing have not only hurt our economy, American businesses, and American workers, they have also undermined, as I started with, our national security. As someone who served in the U.S. Marine Corps, I know the U.S. military depends primarily on two things if we're going to maintain our superiority. Number one, the quality of American service members, and number two, the maintenance of the U.S. military's technological advantages. Through a variety of means, including outright and systematic theft, China's predatory economic practices have eroded and continue to erode our military's technological superiority. In some key defense capabilities, China now fields military equipment and weapons that are as advanced or more advanced than what American service members have. As Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Joe Dunford has said, our military's competitive advantage has eroded and it's no longer as decisive as it was some years ago. Now that's deeply concerning and, of course, not acceptable to we Americans. That eroding American military superiority makes conflict with China more likely and decreases the likelihood that America would prevail in the event of a military conflict. So in short, to reiterate, both our prosperity and our security are at stake. What's also at stake is something more general. more systematic. It's the rules-based international economic order that helped the United States flourish for years, that the United States incidentally helped establish, that has served U.S. interests, and that has enabled the largest expansion and prosperity in world history. However, if we're candid, we must admit, as Thomas Dosterberg did in his Wall Street Journal article last month, that efforts to integrate China into the post-war system and to encourage political liberalization haven't met expectations. China's failed to fulfill its obligations and commitments, and as you write, Mr. Wessel, the U.S. has essentially failed to address Chinese industrial policy since its membership in the WTO. Now is the time to change course. Based on this diagnosis, we must ask how best to respond to this fundamental and historic challenge. Now, that's why Senators Merkley, Rubio, and Coons joined me in introducing last month the bipartisan National Economic Security Strategy Act of 2018. This legislation would create a statutory requirement for the periodic production and submission to Congress of a national economic security strategy. This would complement and support the national security strategy with more focus on U.S. economic interests. This isn't about undercutting our free market economy or promoting excessive government intrusion in the private sector. Far from it. The federal government has an appropriately limited, but still important role in facilitating the ability of the United States to compete successfully in the international economy that's so vital to our prosperity and our security. We want that federal role to be as optimal as possible. We want it to be thoughtful, effective, not reflexive, uncoordinated, ad hoc, and counterproductive. That's something Republicans and Democrats alike can agree on, I know. In many cases, that means catalyzing and empowering the private sector. It also means habitually and effectively standing up for Americans and American companies when they confront predatory economic and trade practices. It also means identifying allies and partners who have similarly suffered from Beijing's predatory economic practices and building an international multilateral coalition to apply maximal pressure to persuade Beijing to end its predatory practices. As you write in your prepared statement, Mr. Wessel, the entire world economy has been impacted by China's predatory international economic and business practices, and that provides an opportunity for coalition building to address China's policies and practices. In short, and as I conclude, the goal of our legislation is to ensure federal policies, statutes, regulations, and procedures are optimally designed and implemented to facilitate the competitiveness, prosperity, and security of the United States. That's why I believe our legislation is so important and why I look forward to advancing it. I also look forward to hearing the assessments of our witnesses regarding our legislation. So with those thoughts in mind, I'd now like to call on our ranking member, Senator Merkley, for his opening remarks. Senator Merkley.